Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan features two radio professionals with over 100 years of broadcasting experience between them. Dave Hogan and Randy Houston are both native Western North Carolinians whose rich voices have been heard in every glade, cove, and holler of Western North Carolina and East Tennessee, primarily on AM radio. And between the two of them, they've worked in just about every radio format. As you can imagine, these guys have tons of stories about the day-to-day of live radio and the interactions they've had with listeners and entertainers while they were immersed in, at the time, one of the most influential and informative mediums available. Those experiences will be featured in this podcast series. Check the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts with Randy and Dave on Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another podcast of Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan. I'm Randy Houston.
Howdy, Randy. I'm just so proud to be here. Remember Minnie Pearl using that line?
Here we go.
Howdy! I'm just so proud to be here. Well, sir,
Did you tell me that her, Minnie's sister lived in Hendersonville?
Yes, I learned that since I've become on the radio in Hendersonville, North Carolina. She was quite a regular visiting her sister in Hendersonville in the 40s and 50s, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A lot of people remember her.
Minnie Pearl's name, real name, Sarah Ophelia Holly. She married Henry Cannon. Sarah Ophelia Holly Cannon.
Was that her real name?
Yeah, and did I ever tell you my Minnie Pearl story?
No, I'd love to hear it.
There was a lady named Caroline McElveen, and I don't remember how Caroline McElveen got to Asheville, but we're talking back in the late 60s, I guess. Anyway, I used to go out and do these remote broadcasts all the time, as you did, and still do occasionally. But back in the era I'm talking about, on WSKY, during the summer months, just about every day for a couple of 3 months, I'd be out on the road somewhere doing a remote broadcast. Zeb Lee on the radio station, and we'd do one day of the week in Swannanoa, up the Valley Beautiful. Maybe the next day we'd be over in West Asheville somewhere, maybe the Malvern Hills swimming pool.
Gotcha.
Setting up our old, of course, at that time it was an old Volkswagen bus that was converted into a radio studio. Had a lot of fun broadcasting from there. But anyway, go somewhere about every day, and the sales department would sell advertising to the businesses surrounding that area. Weaverville one day, and so forth and so on. Well, you know how it is when you're out on the road doing a radio broadcast. You want people to come to see you.
Right. That's why you're there.
That's why you're there. And this lady showed up one day, introduced herself. Her name was Caroline McElveen. And she said, you know, I invented Minnie Pearl. I thought,
Okay.
Okay, you invented Minnie Pearl. She was a very eclectic lady, I guess you would say. She had all these ideas. Let's make Asheville the tulip capital of the South. That was one of her ideas. And she had lots of others. But of course, after a while, it kind of got old having this offbeat type lady showing up claiming she invented Minnie Pearl. And this goes on for most of the summer. About every other broadcast I did, Caroline McElveen would show up and start talking about Minnie Pearl. Of course, I never did put her on the air.
Okay.
You know, we got another nutcase on our hands here.
And we've run into a few in this business.
Well, I had occasion when I was in Nashville to talk to Minnie Pearl.
Okay. I think I'm seeing where you're going.
I had this tape recorder with me, and I sat down across a table from Minnie, and I turned that tape recorder on, and I thought, I'll get rid of this Caroline McElveen right away. And I said, Minnie, of course, we exchanged pleasantries, and I said, Minnie, have you ever heard of a lady named Caroline McElveen? Minnie paused for a minute, or a few seconds, and she says, do you know Caroline? There probably wouldn't be a Minnie Pearl if it weren't for Caroline. And so Minnie goes ahead to tell me about how she met Caroline McElveen, and that Caroline had a lot to do with her becoming Minnie Pearl. And, of course, I couldn't wait to get back to Asheville and look her up and get her on the radio and say, hey, I've got the lady who invented Minnie Pearl right here with me on WSKY. So that taught me a lesson. You never dismiss what somebody says, because no matter how far-fetched it may sound, they may be telling the truth. I think Caroline stretched it just a little bit. If I remember all the details of the story, I'm probably going to be forgetting a part of the story, but Minnie, she graduated from Ward Belmont College, which is now Belmont University outside of Nashville.
In Nashville, yeah.
And she graduated in the late 1930s. And, of course, the Depression was still ongoing at that time. She majored in drama and dancing at Belmont. And she went to work for a company out of Noonan, Georgia, singer Alan Jackson's hometown.
Yes.
Outside of Atlanta. And this company had a traveling troupe who would go around to particularly smaller towns and put on these fundraising shows for civic organizations like the Lions Club or the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club. Many would go in advance. Of course, her name was not Minnie at that time. It was Sarah Ophelia. They called her Opie, and the way that came about was her name was Ophelia, and people shortened it to, somehow it came out as Opie. Opie, I think, is what it, for Ophelia. Opie, short for Ophelia. But people thought they were saying Opie, so
okay.
She went through most of her life around her hometown in Centerville, Tennessee, being called Opie. So anyway, at this point, Minnie Pearl was not in existence. But she would go as the advance person a week or so before the show came to town to drum up business. And so she would go speak to schools, civic organizations. Hey, we're going to have this show, and it's going to be about this, that, or the other, whatever the show was. With the Depression still going on, she wound up staying with somebody in the town that she was visiting, maybe for several days. So it was down in Alabama. I forget the name of the town. But she was staying with this family, and a very country family. I believe it was on Pine Mountain in Alabama. And this lady had a very interesting way of speaking, and that's where Minnie Pearl got her voice.
Okay.
Mimicking this lady that she stayed with for several days. And they had a son whom they just nicknamed Brother, called him Brother. And that's where the brother came from in Minnie's act. But anyway, the first time that Minnie Pearl appeared as Minnie Pearl was in Aiken, South Carolina. The aforementioned Caroline McElveen lived in Aiken, South Carolina, and was involved with one of the civic organizations that was sponsoring Minnie's appearance, fundraising appearance.
I gotcha.
This is where Minnie Pearl met Caroline McElveen. And in the course of, I think Caroline was the person assigned to Minnie to show her around town, maybe drive her to these events or whatever. And they got to talking about, and Minnie said, I just need a character. I need to be able to go on stage, not as myself. And so one thing led to another. And they went to a department store there in Aiken, South Carolina, and bought this hat that Minnie Pearl wore on her first appearance as Minnie Pearl in Aiken, South Carolina. Now, if you doubt that story, you can go online and Google Ralph Edwards, This Is Your Life,
yeah.
Minnie Pearl. Now, you know, they would have, Ralph Edwards would have these prominent people, well-known people, and surprise them by having them on the show and bringing on the show a lot of people that they grew up with or people who were important in their life. And I watched that show, and sure enough, there's Caroline McElveen.
I love
as
it.
one of the people that helped Minnie Pearl get started. So Caroline might have been exaggerating just a little bit when she said I invented Minnie Pearl, but she had a lot to do with it. So, like I said, that taught me a lesson. Don't discount what people say. They might be telling the truth.
You know, you bring up that TV show, This Is Your Life. I remember watching that show a lot. It was one of the network shows that came in over that fuzzy old black and white TV that we were talking about earlier, and we'll get around to talking about maybe Arthur Smith and the Cracker Jacks and WBTV Channel 3 in Charlotte. But the This Is Your Life program, one of the ones that stand out in my memory so much of watching that show is when they brought Junior Samples on that show.
I didn't see that one.
You should try to look that up.
I'll try to find it on YouTube, maybe.
Junior sat and cried for 30 minutes. He had tears. He was, as they brought out, and Junior, here is your mother's first cousin that you haven't seen in 20. And he would bust out crying. and it was some kind of show. But you really need to look that up if you can.
By the way, another point on Caroline McElveen, we became good friends. She, I just don't remember how she wound up in Asheville, not full-time resident, but a part-time resident. But she had a home in New York, and she had a small printing press located in not too far from Times Square. And the first time I went to New York, I was going to be making a trip to the Soviet Union, to Russia, with this exchange group. I'd never been to New York, never been to any big city, I don't guess, at that time. But Caroline met me at the airport. She showed me around for a couple of days, took me to NBC studios, and I got a tour of NBC, met the famous sportscaster Red Barber.
Right.
So Caroline became a very, very good friend, and we stayed in touch for a long time. So her idea about Asheville becoming the tulip capital of the South didn't materialize, but Minnie Pearl did.
And boy, did she ever. She sure did. We enjoyed watching Minnie Pearl on the Grand Ole Opry and all of those. And that town, what was the name of that town? It was a fictional town she made up.
Grinder Switch.
Oh, yeah, Grinder Switch.
Actually, there was a little community. It was an old train station. Grinder's Switch.
Okay.
I guess maybe had something to do with switching the train
tracks and all, yeah,
cars or whatever. And that's where Grinder Switch came from.
I remember her telling one story about Nabob.
Mm-hmm.
Nabob was
Cousin Nabob.
Yeah, he was another one of those characters she invented. And I remember her telling the story about, I went home to Grinder Switch the other day and I ran into Cousin Nabob coming down the road pulling a chain. And I said, Nabob, what are you doing pulling that chain? And he said, you ever tried pushing one of these?
Arthur Smith and the Cracker Jacks.
Yeah.
You mentioned them. Did I hear you say you played Tommy Fail and the Brown Mountain Lights on your radio show the other morning?
I sure did.
You ever see the Brown Mountain Lights?
Only on video. I've seen the YouTube videos that people have taken of the Brown Mountain Lights, and I have not seen them personally.
I went up there to the spot where you're supposed to be able to see the Brown Mountain Lights, and parked and stayed all night, and I haven't seen them yet.
Well,
in fact, I went twice. I went twice.
Trying, yeah. They don't happen every night.
Never did see the Brown Mountain Lights, but there's a legend in that area that some say it's atmospheric conditions that cause it or whatever, that near Linville.
Tommy Fail's song, The Brown Mountain Lights, that he performed on that Arthur Smith show quite regularly. It was a fan favorite. I don't know that it ever was received nationally as a hit or anything, but of course around here in our region it was a big hit song. And Tommy does a recitation part in that song, and he says, "In the mountains of North Carolina near Linville, there exists a strange phenomenon called the Brown Mountain Lights. On a clear night, this light will appear and move about in a ghost-like manner on the mountaintops and down in the canyons below. Scientists have come from near and far, and no one to this day can explain the mystery and the legend of the Brown Mountain Lights." And then that guitar would take off and he'd sing. How did he? I can't remember the verbiage to the song. I sang that song with Whitewater Bluegrass Company. Bill Byerly, my dear friend, and we had Bill come out and play his bluegrass band one day when we were doing a concert series at a radio station we both worked at in Hendersonville. And the band played, and I remembered that song and got up sang it with Bill and the bunch. I'll never forget it. It's a great song.
Well, you do a good job of that recitation, Randy. You ought to be on the radio.
One of these days.
Arthur Smith and the Cracker Jacks had a very popular TV show at one time, and before that, radio. In fact, my Uncle Arvil, Whitey and Hogan and the Briarhoppers, worked with Arthur Smith back in the days of live radio shows, and my uncle knew Arthur very well and used to tell the story about the time that the movie Deliverance came out.
Right.
Burt Reynolds was the big star in Deliverance, and there are other prominent actors in the movie. But there was a banjo tune called Dueling Banjos.
Oh, yeah.
That was used in that movie.
Do-do-do-do-do.
Do-do-do-do-do.
Back and forth, yeah.
Back and forth, the guitar and the banjo. Eric Weisberg was credited with writing what was called Dueling Banjos. Now, Arthur Smith was listening to the radio one day. Uh-oh, somebody has stolen my song. He had Arthur Smith and Don Reno, who was raised in Haywood County in Western North Carolina.
Okay.
They called it feudin' banjos.
Okay.
And somewhere along the line, whoever produced or directed the movie got hold of that. And Eric Weisberg, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Eric Weisberg played the banjo, and they used it in the movie. Well, of course, Arthur, when he heard that, here's a huge hit movie.
And then that title track, that banjo, Dueling Banjos, was released to radio and made a giant hit
it was
across the board.
Tremendous hit. Played on even non-country radio stations. Played
Big hit.
Dueling Banjos. So my Uncle Arvil told me the story that Arthur went to New York City to meet with whoever, I don't remember, United Artists or whoever was responsible for the music in the movie, to plead his case that, hey, I want some royalties. Arthur went in with the idea that he would maybe settle for a set sum, a certain amount of money that he was going to sue them for using his song without attributing the song to him. But supposedly, according to the story, Arthur was sitting there in the lobby of this organization, and he heard somebody in the distance, but close enough that he could understand them, say, "There's some hillbilly from North Carolina here that claims he wrote dueling banjos." And when Arthur heard that, he said, I'm not going to settle for a set amount of money. I want royalties.
I'm going to get this hillbilly's going to show him what it's all about.
Yeah, and he did.
Big time.
He did big time. He got a huge chunk of that money. And his estate, I'm sure, is still getting royalties.
Yeah.
Off of Dueling Banjos, which was written by Arthur Smith.
That's a classic story in song royalties and composers and copyright laws. That was one of the first violations of that, I guess, and Arthur made it work. Arthur was ahead of his time, I guess. He had, of course, that TV show, and that TV show, if I'm not mistaken, was the very first thing that WBTV Channel 3 aired. When they went on the air, they had already been on radio, 1110 WBT AM in Charlotte. We could get it here in the mountains back in the day, because I remember listening.
And the Briarhoppers, of which my uncle was a part, Whiting and Hogan, they came on right after the Lone Ranger.
Wow.
I think about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I remember being at my grandfather's house, and of course, his son was Arvel, and
they were listening.
We'd gather around the radio, and I'd get to listen to the Lone Ranger. I was more interested in the Lone Ranger than I was hearing the music program.
It's a good slot for them to be in because Lone Ranger's a good draw, man.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Yes. Then, and we touched on this on one of our previous podcasts, all these local radio stations started popping up around the country, and WBT's influence started waning because people started listening to their local radio station.
Right.
And so the way they made their money was not doing the radio show. It was the bookings, the public appearances that they were able to get as a result of the radio show.
Gotcha.
Same with the Grand Ole Opry. The Grand Ole Opry. They wanted to be on the Grand Ole Opry on WSM, which had a signal across much of the United States, and they'd get these bookings, and that's how they made their money. But when local radio, every little town started getting radio stations, people started listening to their local radio, and I think you referred to this as crowding the dial. A lot of these radio stations went on the air, and it was harder and harder to pick up these stations like WSM and WBT, except at night. And so my uncle and his partner, Whitey Grant, went to work for the Postal Service and retired from the post office after their music careers. Of course, they continued in music part-time. I guess if you ever get into music, you're always doing it at some level.
Yeah, WBT, a pioneer broadcasting facility. And you talked about how the other small stations around started popping up in the 40s and 50s, and that's exactly what created the openings for young kids like yourself and me to go down to that radio station and see if you can get a job talking on the radio.
You remember who was known as the Walter Cronkite of the Carolinas on WBT radio?
Oh, my goodness, on WBT. Doug
Mays.
I started to say Doug Mays. He later when television came along, he became the TV news anchor.
Right. He was a very popular news anchor.
Yeah.
On TV, and then he was billed as not officially, but people called him the Walter Cronkite of the Carolinas.
Doug Mays.
He was a trusted newsman for many years. Well, my uncle, I mentioned him, Orville Hogan, part of the duo of Whitey and Hogan on the Briarhoppers on WBT. When he died, the nephews, me included, were the pallbearers at his funeral held in Charlotte. Doug Mays sat behind me at the funeral.
Wow.
Because he and my uncle were very good friends, and I enjoyed chatting with Doug. I was working in Johnson City at the time, and we got to talking about Johnson City, and Doug said, you know where I started my career in radio? In Kingsport, on WKPT in Kingsport. And he said, I went on the air my first time on Pearl Harbor Day, 1941, December the 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor Day. And so he said, I started with a bang.
Part of that news crew was the weatherman named Cloudy McLean.
Cloudy McLean, what a great name for a weatherman.
We came up with an idea when I was working at 570 WWNC in Asheville back in the 80s that the maintenance guy and janitor at the radio station's name was Roy Coleman. Roy's long gone now, but he was a character. So he was just an old mountain guy, and so I don't know, got dreaming around one day and said, Cloudy, Roy, why don't you do a weather thing? A weather show for me, a fishing report, I think it was, because Roy liked to fish. Well, yeah, but I need a name, and I don't know how in the world it just came to me, Cloudy Coleman. Cloudy Coleman, and that stuck. It stuck. Everybody started calling him Cloudy Coleman. Yeah, because it was named after Cloudy McLean. There was a sportscaster on there named Harold Johnson, I believe. I can't remember, but they were so groundbreaking, and like you said at the time, it was like only one of two or three snowy television signals that we could pull into to Houston Holler.
Well, do you remember the first time you got cable TV?
Oh, yes.
And the days we're talking about was pre-cable TV.
Oh, definitely.
And you had to have an outdoor antenna on top of your house in most cases.
Dave, we just sit here and talk about this stuff and broadcasting history of North Carolina and all around and what we've done. And that's the whole intent and purpose of our Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan podcast. And we have already consumed another 30-minute block here. So we're going to take a break and invite you to come back next week, or in the next couple of weeks. We'll drop another podcast in 2 weeks. We do that every other Sunday, as a matter of fact.
And hit the subscribe button.
Do that, please.
Wherever you get your podcast.
And it will automatically be downloaded for you to listen to on Sundays. And we'll be back and talk more radio stuff on Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan.
Be sure to click the subscribe button for another episode of Hot Mic with Randy Houston and Dave Hogan.